Hello! Let's talk about architecture. Today I want to talk to you guys about the organization of experience. I'm going to cover 3 different terms, which are scale, program, and zoning. And I'm going to walk you through what those mean, the definitions, their importance to architecture, and then we're going to go into some examples. So understanding the organization of spaces, how they're designed on several scales, is important to uncovering intentions, biases, and history that will enable us to think and create critically. Today we will learn how to be detectives and uncover hidden stories behind design. So the first term I want to talk to you guys about is scale. Scale is the measurement of size. It usually adds another layer of meaning, and in architectural context it is representational. So what do I mean by that? Well, the literal definition of scale is, you could say, 1/4 of an inch equals a foot. You might see that on a construction drawing on a set of documents. So I'm sure you also have seen a floor plan, right? It's a drawing of a space, a building, and it's on a piece of paper, but we understand that typically it represents something larger. So I gave you the example of a 1/4 inch scale before, so that would mean, by doing some simple math, 1 inch is equal to 4 feet. So 1 inch of paper space is equal to 4 feet of real space or representational space. Hello. I thought I could do a little better job explaining this. So I just drew a quick graphic scale. This is how you'll see them represented a lot of times. I'm not sure why, but it just kind of graphically blocks the distances off. So you see I have 1/4 of an inch is 1 foot. So I have a 1/4 of an inch space right here, and that is 1 foot. So then 2/4 or half is 2 feet, and then this is, okay, I messed it up. Let me start over. 1/4 of an inch equals a foot. 2/4 or half an inch is equal to 2 feet, which is a span from 1 to 2. And then 4 feet is equal to 1 inch. And then we have 8 feet is equal to 2 inches. So we go from that to this. So 1/4 of an inch on paper is equal to a foot in real space. And then we have 2 feet. 1, 2. So this is a concept we'll get into a little bit later when we start creating plans, sections, elevations, and models. Another way to think about scale is the scale of an idea. So this is more of an abstract scale. So take the idea of space, for example. We can think of space as our personal space. This is our personal bubble that we as humans occupy, but you can also scale that thinking up, so we can think of space as in relation to a room, which can hold several people. We can scale it up again and think about a building that can hold many, many people, and then we can scale up the idea of space even more to think of neighborhood, city, country, the whole globe. So in this way, scale is referring to the scope of an idea, like space. Let's take a more literal example. So let's take a banana, for example. We know approximately how big a banana is in relation to our own body. But if we add a door, a window, maybe even a person, the banana becomes much more than a banana. The banana can be looked at as a building or as architecture. So just with a few simple moves, you've turned a very well-known object and completely turned it on its head. And that is the power of scale. So I wanted to start off telling you guys about scale because it relates to the 2 other terms I spoke about, program and zoning. Both of those words also have a couple definitions, but in terms of architecture, they both relate to the organization of the space. Program is usually used to describe how a building or a specific room is used, and zoning is very similar to program, but it's usually referred to on a more urban scale for a city, for example. So I said that program defines how a building or room is organized. It usually describes what the building does, what it holds, and how it operates. And usually this description implies a set of rules to use the space. So let's take a library, for example. A library does learning. It holds books, librarians, and computers. It operates like a store, but everything is free because it is paid for by the collective tax dollars. And you imagine when you go into a library, you're often quiet, courteous, respectful of others. So that's a very basic example of program. Another example is a dance club, right? A dance club, just like a library does learning, a dance club does entertainment. It holds alcohol, music, people, and it operates kind of like a playground. So you can see that program kind of encompasses a wide range of things in relation to a building. It talks about what role it holds within our society. For example, library is for education, a club is for entertainment. Program can also be specific to rooms. So if you think of your house, you have a bedroom, you have a bathroom, you have a kitchen, you have a living room, and each of those rooms has its own specific program for how you interact. But it's the same, right? So just as the program of a building prescribes the role, what it holds, and how you act in it, so does the program of a room. So we know the role of a bathroom, we know what it holds, and we know how we usually act in a bathroom. So let's think about a dollhouse. I think that would be a good way to explore this concept further. A dollhouse is a toy that clearly prescribes programs for each of its spaces. You make food in the kitchen, you watch TV in the living room, you take a shower in the bathroom. The toy dollhouse capitalizes on the romanticism of ideal life and this idea of program. So it's not hard to extrapolate a dollhouse onto a real house. The architect who designed your home prescribed a set of activities and patterns for living. But what I would like to investigate is what happens if the architect is wrong? What if someone says, I don't really cook, I don't need a kitchen?
Hey, welcome AD, come on in. All right, so through these doors is the kitchen. I can't say that the kitchen sees a lot of cooking action because after all, that's what restaurants are for. Although you do make the occasional piece of toast.
So do you see how in their house, the kitchen is really separated by 4 walls from the rest of the house? This is a fairly traditional building style that's kind of gone out of fashion. Now, this could be for any number of reasons, but I think we can look towards the feminist movement, and women becoming accepted in society as equals has really kind of ratified these what used to be back of house spaces, and now they are the center of the house for gathering, for entertaining guests, things like that. And we can see the direct impact on the architectural space.
What's important to pull out here is that evolutions in time, in culture, all go hand in hand with shifts in the architectural organization as well. So if we think about those two as being intimately linked, we can easily see how the design and organization of spaces is kind of like a fingerprint of society. It represents how people think, it represents how people act, what roles they play in society, things like that. So I think Edward T. Hall talks about this really well in his book called The Hidden Dimension. On page 104, he's kind of addressing the evolution of the household. And he says, in the 18th century, the house altered its form. In French, chambre was distinguished from salle. In English, the function of room was indicated by its name. Bedroom, living room, dining room. Rooms were arranged to open into a corridor or hall, like houses on a street. No longer did the occupants pass through one room into another. Relieved from the Grand Central Station atmosphere and protected by new spaces, the family pattern began to stabilize and was expressed further in the form of the house. So we talked a little bit about what program means to a building or a room. Now I want to talk about what program means to a larger urban context, a city, for example. So I said that's sometimes called zoning. Zoning is similar to program, but with different labels. So instead of the hallway, you have the highway, right? Everything is scaled up. Financial and business districts, residential areas, and industrial zones are all examples of common zones in a city. For example, you can Google zoning map of Chicago and pull up a city record of every address, block, street in Chicago and what zone it's in. And of course, like we've talked about with the program, zoning is a type of organization. It's a planning tool that is used to ensure that a house doesn't exist in the middle of factories, for example, in an industrial zone, or that skyscrapers don't wander too far out of the city. It's also used to curb things like urban sprawl, create efficient traffic patterns, and more. But just as we discussed with program, there are some important questions that arise, such as who is the planner, what inherent biases do they have, what agenda do they follow, and we'll discuss these next with a couple examples. For now, I want you to pause this lecture, take a couple minutes to write down a thought you have or a question you're pondering, and during next class's discussion, we'll talk about what thoughts and questions you guys have. Okay, we're back. So we've gone over planning and zoning and understood that they're both organizational tools for spaces on different scales. Now let's look at some of the inherent biases, intentions, and history of the people who design, construct, approve, and use these buildings. Let's play detective and uncover interesting stories behind architecture. So the first example I have is from a book called The Architecture of Happiness. It was written by Alain de Botton, and it was published in 2006. So this is a great introduction to architecture in and of itself if you're looking for some additional reading material. But right now I'm interested in the chapter on talking buildings. And in this chapter, Botton, the author reviews some of the ways that design can be personified and have direct impact on culture, and with which we can derive some important shifts in society. So he talks about sculpture, he talks about fonts, he talks about drinking glasses, he talks about noses, and his main argument is that everything we see, everything around us, whether it's designed or not, holds important visual cues and allow us to subconsciously judge everything around us. So the author brings into account two buildings made by Germany for the World's Fair. These are two pavilions which kind of are meant to represent the country for which they stand. He points to two specific pavilions. The first is for the Paris Fair of 1937, and then 21 years later, after the Second World War, he points to the 1958 World Exposition in Brussels. So in the span of 21 years, Germany has gone from a fascist state to a democratic republic, and he points to visual cues in each of the pavilions that could be representative of those changes. In the first pavilion, we have really strong columns. It's a hugely tall pavilion. It's really intimidating and kind of overbearing looking. There's almost no windows. There's a giant statue of an eagle on top that looks like it's about to come and peck your eyes out, in comparison to the second one, which is very light and airy. It uses a lot of glass, and the whole building is visible from the outside. And in the last paragraph about this example, the author says, "So eloquently are materials and colors then, that a facade can be made to speak of how a country should be ruled and which principles ought to govern its foreign policy." He's talking about how clearly the materials, the styles of architecture can be read. Political and ethical ideas can be written into window frames and door handles. An abstract glass box on a stone plinth can deliver a paean to tranquility and civilization. Paean just means like triumphant song. So he's saying that the abstract glass box stands for this new form of government based on tranquility and civilization. So the next example I want to discuss is called redlining, and redlining is the name for a racially discriminate practice of dividing cities into areas based on how apparently successful a neighborhood was. And this started around 1935 in Chicago and was more or less adopted across the United States at that time. So like I said, it was based on how successful a neighborhood was, and the criteria for success in the bank's eyes was how new the buildings were. So the newer affluent suburbs kind of on the outskirts of the city were denoted as green on maps, and older areas were denoted as red. The problem with this is that because of systemic racism, the older areas were cheaper to live in, closer downtown, and often occupied by Black communities. So these redlined areas were technically denoting the age of a building, but in reality they were outlining they were illustrating the areas of Black and other minority communities within the city. And if your neighborhood or your area where you lived was denoted as redlined, you were unable to get a mortgage from the bank. So if you wanted to buy a house, if you wanted to renovate, if you wanted to invest at all in your neighborhood, you were probably not going to be given a loan by the bank. So very easily we can see how this creates a zone of disinvestment and racial segregation within the city. So as I said, this practice was formally began around 1935, and it would continue until 1974 when Chicago's Metropolitan Area Housing Association would convince Illinois to pass laws requiring banking transparency. So Chicago is a prominent example of historic redlining and the eventual success in overthrowing it. But this happened all over the nation, and it hasn't stopped today. There are still many more racially biased practices that govern zoning. And I bring this example up because this is something that's hard to see with your eyes. It's kind of invisible until you start to look into banking law, until you start looking into the zoning of a city. So these biases are incredibly important for those in positions of design and privilege to recognize and take into consideration. And it's also important to start to understand the world around you and start to think critically about why things are the way they are and how design choices can greatly affect those. So we've come to the end of this video. Just to recap, we've talked about scale, program, and zoning. So now I just want you to revisit your notes, rewatch this video if you would like to, and write down a thought or a question you have and bring it to class for us to discuss. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.